the plates were still warm when I set them down, heat clinging to my fingers like it didn't know my mother had died that morning. The dining room lights buzzed softly above me. Too bright. Catching on the polished silverware and the dark fabric of the dress I hadn't bothered to change out of. My chest felt hollow, like I was moving through smoke instead of air. Every step practiced. Automatic. If you're listening to this and you've ever been forced to hold yourself together when everything inside was breaking, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not alone in this. I remember the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of voices, the weight of eyes that saw the meal but not the grief. One person, though, kept watching me differently. Noticing the tremor, I couldn't stop. I didn't know it then. But that night would pull everything I believed apart. That was the moment my life began to unravel. I was balancing a tray of hot plates when the room tilted. Heat rushing up my arms. Laughter buzzing too loudly around me. 3 hours earlier, my mother had died, and somehow I was still standing in my own dining room, pretending this night mattered. My hands shook as I moved between the table and the kitchen, forcing my face into something calm. Grief sat in my chest like a weight I could not set down. I had been told to smile, to serve, to keep everything smooth because this dinner was important. Important enough to swallow my pain and keep moving. The air smelled of roasted meat and polished wine glasses. Voices clinked together like silverware. I wore the only black dress I owned. Not to make a statement, but because it felt wrong to wear anything else. It was the quiet way I knew how to honor my mother when I was not allowed to stop. Each step felt heavier than the last. My vision blurred, not from exhaustion alone, but from the effort of holding myself together while everyone else carried on. I kept my eyes down, focusing on tasks, on breathing, on not falling apart in front of strangers. Then I felt it. A pause in the room. A weight that did not belong to grief alone. I was never someone who needed much. Before my marriage, my world was small, steady, and quietly full. I worked as a seamstress in a little shop near Cedar Street, spending my days repairing hems, fixing buttons, and turning worn fabric into something useful again. I learned that patience from my mother. We lived together for years in a modest apartment above a bakery, where mornings smelled like bread and afternoons were stitched together with routine. She taught me how to sew, but more than that, she taught me how to stay gentle without becoming weak. She believed kindness was something you practiced, not something you waited to receive. When I wasn't working, I sat by the window with fabric in my lap, letting my hands move while my thoughts settled. Sewing was my refuge. It made sense in a way people sometimes didn't. Broken things could be mended if you gave them time and care. I wore a small silver locket every day, tucked close to my chest. It was my mother's, passed down without ceremony. Just another object filled with quiet meaning. I never asked many questions about it. I didn't feel the need to. When I met my husband, I believed I was choosing stability. I thought love looked like consistency, like someone who didn't leave. I didn't know that the very traits I was proud of, my patience, my loyalty, my willingness to endure, would slowly become the tools used against me. Back then, I truly believed I was building a safe life. I had no idea how much it would eventually cost. That innocence would not survive what came next. Even in small ways alone. I tell people now that my marriage didn't break all at once. It thinned, quietly, the way fabric wears down at the seams. At the beginning, there was affection, Small surprises. The comfort of believing I had chosen the right person. I told myself this was what stability felt like. But slowly, the warmth shifted. Compliments turned into suggestions. Suggestions into corrections. I began hearing what I did wrong more clearly than anything I did right. It started with my work. He questioned why I sewed for a living, why I was satisfied with something so small. I laughed it off, telling myself he only wanted more for us. When he asked to manage our finances, I agreed, convinced I was being practical, not controlled. Little by little, decisions stopped feeling like mine. I adjusted my schedule to avoid tension. I explained away my discomfort. I learned which moods to anticipate, which topics to avoid. Peace became something I worked for, not something we shared. I blamed myself often. I thought if I were calmer, more organized, less sensitive, things would settle. I shrank my needs so they wouldn't provoke irritation. I called it compromise because that sounded healthier than fear. The hardest part was how ordinary it all looked from the outside. No shouting, no obvious cruelty, just a steady erosion of confidence that left me doubting my instincts. Eventually, our home stopped feeling like a partnership. It felt like a place where I had to stay alert, careful, quiet. I didn't know it yet, but I was already surviving. And when the worst day of my life arrived, I would finally understand how alone I truly was. That realization waited just beyond the phone call that would shatter everything I thought I could endure that morning alone completely. I was at work when the call came, my phone vibrating against my apron like an afterthought. I stepped into the back room, already knowing something was wrong, yet unprepared for how completely it would empty me. When I understood that my mother was gone, the world went quiet. Not peaceful, hollow. I stood there holding the fabric I had been hemming, unable to move, unable to cry. My body stayed upright while my mind drifted somewhere far away, as if grief had pressed pause instead of play. I left the shop and walked home through streets that looked exactly the same. Cars passed. People laughed. A dog barked behind a fence. It felt obscene that everything continued while my life had just split open. I remember thinking that if I kept walking, maybe the truth would catch up to me and feel real. All I wanted was to hear one steady voice tell me I wasn't alone. I imagined being held. I imagined quiet. I imagined permission to fall apart. Instead, I was met with irritation and expectation. The loss that had just taken my mother from the world barely registered. What mattered was dinner, timing, appearances. I realized then that comfort was not coming. Not today. Not ever. I stood there with grief still locked inside my chest, understanding for the first time that I would have to carry this alone. And as the evening crept closer, another demand waited for me. One that would force my pain into silence again. Before the night fully closed around me, I changed into my black dress as the sun dropped lower, my hands moving on instinct while my mind stayed somewhere else. By 7:30 p.m., the house was full. Voices layered over one another, glasses chiming, chairs scraping softly across the floor. I moved through the rooms carrying plates, refilling water, smiling when expected. My body knew the routine even if my heart didn't. Grief stayed just beneath my skin, pulsing, waiting for a moment I never got. Each correction, each subtle nudge to hurry or adjust, reminded me to stay small and useful. The room smelled of food and expensive cologne. Laughter rose and fell like waves I had to keep swimming through. I focused on details to stay upright. The warmth of dishes, the steady rhythm of steps between kitchen and table. Dissociating felt safer than feeling. One guest watched quietly. I noticed it not because he stared, but because he didn't look away when my hands shook or when my breath caught unexpectedly. His attention felt heavier than the rest, thoughtful rather than impatient. It made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. As I leaned forward to pour another drink, the chain at my neck slipped. The small silver locket slid free, resting against the fabric of my dress. The room seemed to pause, as if someone had lowered the volume without asking. I felt eyes settle on me, not judging, but searching. Something tightened in my chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition that this moment mattered. The air had shifted. I knew, with a certainty that cut through the noise, that the night had changed direction. Whatever came next was already moving toward me. I stood there breathing carefully, understanding that silence had been broken and that my life, held together by habit, was about to be examined by someone who finally saw what I was carrying, without asking permission from anyone else. I followed his gaze to the locket resting against my chest. The way his expression shifted from curiosity to something far deeper. Shock, recognition, and a weight that felt personal moved across his face. And I felt it echo inside me. My mother's name surfaced quietly, carried by his attention rather than his voice. Places followed. A county she once mentioned and then refused to talk about. A past she kept sealed tight. Memories I had never questioned suddenly rearranged themselves, clicking into place with an unsettling clarity. I remembered how little she shared about her childhood, how she avoided certain questions, how the locket was never just jewelry, but something guarded, standing there. I understood that what I was seeing wasn't coincidence. It was lineage. The realization landed slowly, and all at once. The man seated at my table wasn't just a guest with influence. He was my mother's brother, my uncle. Blood I never knew existed. Grief collided with disbelief. I had lost my mother hours earlier, and yet here was a living connection to her life before me. It felt like discovering a door in a wall I thought was solid, suddenly open, revealing an entire hidden room. As the truth settled, the air in the room changed again. The weight shifted away from me. For the first time that night, I was not the smallest presence at the table. Something ancient and undeniable had surfaced, and I could feel it pressing forward, ready to be acknowledged by everyone watching. As the night edged toward its end, once the truth surfaced, everything my husband relied on began to slip. He tried to laugh, to smooth the moment over. But the confidence that usually carried him was gone. I watched his posture change, his voice thin out. His certainty drain as authority in the room shifted away from him. My uncle didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone reframed the evening. And with it, my place in it. Decisions were made calmly and publicly. Consequences laid out without cruelty. Careers, opportunities, and access my husband had treated as guaranteed were suddenly not his to command. What surprised me most was my own stillness. The fear I had lived with for so long loosened its grip. I felt grounded, clear, almost quiet inside. For the first time, I wasn't calculating how to keep the peace. I was simply observing it being restored without my sacrifice. I realized then that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just arrives and rearranges the room. My husband saw it too. The way he looked at me changed. Not with anger yet, but with disbelief that control had slipped beyond his reach. I stood straighter than I had in years. I met his eyes without apology. Inside, something settled into place. I didn't need permission anymore. That night, in front of witnesses, I chose myself. I understood this wasn't the end, only the first collapse. What followed would be louder, more desperate, and dangerous. But the balance had already tipped, and there was no way to force it back. The church was quiet in a way that pressed against my ribs. Soft music floated through the room, and lilies filled the air with a sweetness that made my throat ache. I stood near the front, holding the program with my mother's photo, trying to stay upright through waves of grief that came without warning. People spoke in murmurs, sharing small stories about her kindness. I clung to those fragments because they were all I had left. For a few minutes, the world felt paused, respectful, almost gentle. Then greed walked in. The stillness cracked as legal papers were pushed forward. Authority invoked where compassion should have lived. I felt the ground tilt again. The same disorientation as the day she died. My husband had found a way to insert himself into this moment, turning my mother's burial into a transaction. A delay. A threat. Shock swallowed my breath. I couldn't understand how anyone could stand in a place of mourning and calculate gain. The humiliation burned quietly, mixed with rage. I didn't yet know how to release. An outside authority stepped in and shut it down, restoring order. But the damage lingered. The room never fully recovered its peace. Neither did I. As I bowed my head, I made a promise I had never needed before to myself alone. After the funeral, silence finally gave me space to look at paperwork I had avoided. Deeds. Letters. That records my mother had kept neatly folded. What I found stripped the last layer of confusion away. The land she owned was not just sentimental. It sat in the path of a planned development. Its value multiplied over years. Numbers I had never imagined were attached to the soil I grew up running across. Suddenly, everything made sense. My husband's impatience, his sudden interest in timelines, the pressure wrapped in concern. None of it had been random or emotional. It had been strategic. He wasn't reacting to my grief. He was waiting for it to pass so the transfer could begin. I felt anger rise, sharp and clean, cutting through the fog of mourning. I saw how long he had been positioning himself, how carefully he had hidden greed behind routine control. Even the funeral disruption fit into that pattern now. Another attempt to force an outcome. Grief didn't disappear, but it hardened into purpose. My mother's life had built something real, something meant to protect, not be exploited. I decided then that nothing else would be taken quietly. Protecting what she left meant protecting myself. And I knew that resolve would provoke him in ways I was not yet prepared to face. I unlocked the door to the apartment and knew before stepping inside that something was wrong. The air felt hollow. Drawers were pulled out, cushions slashed, shelves emptied onto the floor like the remains of a storm. I moved slowly, touching things as if they might bruise me back. My clothes were ripped. My sewing table was overturned. Needles scattered. Fabric cut down the center. Even the small box where I kept my mother's letters had been dumped. Pages trampled. Corners torn. In the kitchen, envelopes lay open across the counter. Notices I did not recognize. Accounts I never opened. Loans taken in my name. Signatures that looked like mine but were not. The amounts were staggering. enough to sink me for years. I stood there reading, realizing this had not been a moment of rage. It had been planned. Every room told the same story. He had taken what he wanted and destroyed what he could not carry. My home was no longer shelter. It was evidence. I sat on the floor until the light faded, breathing through the shock. Something inside me hardened in that quiet. I understood then that losing control had made him dangerous, and whatever came next would not stay contained. I felt his presence, even in absence. A warning pressed against the walls ahead. I woke to the smell of smoke before the heat reached me. It was faint at first, like a warning I wanted to ignore, then sharp enough to sting my throat. When I opened the bedroom door, the hallway breathed back at me, dark and hot, smoke rolling low as if the house had learned how to hunt. My phone showed missed calls from him. The realization landed with the weight of a verdict. This was not an accident. He had come back for the only thing he thought he had left: control. I moved fast and small, keeping my head low, counting steps I had walked 100 times. The walls were warm. The air crackled. Every choice narrowed to one question: live or hesitate. I wrapped my sleeve around my face, pushed through the kitchen, and found the back window already clouded with soot. The glass fought me, then gave. Cold air sliced in, a shock that cleared my mind. I climbed out, cut my palm, barely felt it, and dropped into the yard. Sirens rose somewhere close, then closer, as neighbors shouted and lights snapped on like constellations. I watched from the grass as flames took the roof and firefighters took over. He was pulled away in handcuffs, coughing, smaller than the fear he had used. In that moment, shaking and alive, I understood the fire had burned the last bridge between us. Survival changed the shape of everything. Fear loosened its grip. What followed would be measured, named public, and final. Carried not by me alone, but by the law that arrived with the dawn. It would begin with statements, reports, and courtrooms, where truth stands under lights and consequences replace threats, marking the reckoning he could never escape again now that I was free to testify there. Survival gave way to process. After the fire, days blurred into interviews, photographs, reports, and timelines laid out with clinical care. Investigators listened, not to my fear, but to facts. Patterns emerged where I had once blamed myself. Records spoke. Neighbors corroborated. The house, the debts, the threats, the accelerants. All of it aligned into something solid. The courtroom felt smaller than the danger had been, yet heavier. Wood and fluorescent light held a gravity I could not ignore. When I took the stand, my voice steadied as I named what happened without apology. I was not performing pain. I was accounting for it. Evidence followed, calm and relentless, turning memory into proof. The verdict arrived without drama. It sounded ordinary, almost quiet, and that was its power. Guilt was acknowledged. Responsibility was assigned. Sentencing followed with language that mattered, measured and final, separating consequence from vengeance. Justice did not cheer. It settled. I felt the release as an exhale I had postponed for years. Fear loosened. The future did not rush in. It waited, respectful of the cost. As I left the courthouse, I understood that accountability had closed a door, not to the past, but to its control over me. With that door shut, I could finally face what comes next. Slower, gentler, and built on repair rather than punishment. And hope learned to breathe again without asking permission. I returned to spaces that no longer recognized me, and I learned to make them mine anyway. The walls were bare, the silence unfamiliar, but it was safe. I unpacked slowly, choosing what stayed and what I was ready to release. Grief still lived there, folded into corners. Yet it no longer dictated every breath. Rebuilding was not dramatic. It looked like cleaning one drawer, then another. It sounded like a sewing machine humming again, tentative at first, then steady. My hands remembered before my heart did, stitch by stitch. Fabric became proof that I could still create something whole. The locket rested nearby, not as a wound, but as a reminder of where I came from and what survived. People showed up in quiet ways. A neighbor checked in. A friend brought meals without questions. I learned how to accept help without translating it into debt. Community felt different when fear was gone. It felt optional, not enforced. I reclaimed my time, my name, my work. I set up a small studio by a window and let light in on purpose. Some days were heavy, and I honored them. Other days surprised me with ease. This was not a clean beginning. It was a deliberate one. From here, living would mean more than surviving, and meaning would come from choosing how to move forward, one step at a time. I once thought survival meant staying quiet and getting through the day. Now I understand it means choosing myself, even when it feels unfamiliar. This journey took me from silence to danger, from fear to clarity, and finally to ownership of my own life. Nothing erased the past, but it no longer defines every step. If you are listening to this while doubting your worth, I want you to know that your instincts matter. Control often hides behind routine, and love never requires you to disappear. Reclaiming yourself does not happen all at once. It happens in small, stubborn choices to breathe, to speak, to stay. I am grateful to be here, to be alive, and to be able to tell this story on my own terms. Thank you for holding space for it. If any part of this resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts or your experience in the comments. And if this story found you at the right moment, consider staying with the channel. Connection is how we remind each other living is possible.